Well, Vinny, thanks for having me, and really appreciate the opportunity. As you said, I am the executive vice president of product and technology for Workday, and as such, I'm responsible really for the service that Workday provides its customers and the architecture and platform that that service is built on. You mentioned I've had a long career, which is, thank you. It's a nice way of saying I'm old, and I am.
You have a little
I've
more
been
head
in
than
the
I do, so
industry.
you don't need to apologize.
And I've been in the industry for a while, and have been at Workday almost 7 years now. Joined Workday through the acquisition of a startup I had co-founded, and joined Workday in 2015, and was really expecting to stay for a little while, and then go off and start another company, and have surprised myself and probably Workday continuously by staying now almost 7 years, because really there's always been a great challenge, and Workday really has been a great company for me to be at, and so it's never gotten old, and that's why why we're talking.
Sayan, so we had a conversation a couple of months ago, and we talked about Sova, right? That I was at Gartner when we coined the term Sova. Well, I think since you and I talked, Gartner has, partly bragging, it's been around 25 years, but they acknowledged, it was hyped up. Then it went through a period of people who were like derisive about it. And then he says, now it is, services are part of the whole fabric of the industry. Basically, that's what they said. You've been around the industry long enough. And we were cracking jokes about some of the SOA evolution. Tell the audience about, how you've seen SOA evolve, how you've seen services evolve, in your career.
Absolutely. Look, I think that, as backdrop for it, I think it's important to recognize, for all of us to recognize, that almost every technology goes through a hype cycle. We talk a lot about it. We talk about how transformative it is. We overhype it, right? And then slowly and inexorably, it is transformative in many cases. It just happens in a different way than maybe we expected it to, or in the time frame we expected it to. I look back on, and I'm easily old enough to look back on the startups I was doing in 1999 as we rose on the cycle of the .com, right, and the collapse that came after that. But the reality, Vinny, is it was transformative. If we look back now at 1999, what we would say that the specific companies may not have survived it, may not be the household names we have today. But the transformative nature of what was going on has transformed how we think about the internet, how we think about technology, how we use technology, and the facility with which we use technology today versus something that was, pretty isolated and is now ubiquitous. And so I think that's one backdrop that I think about is, whenever we face a hype cycle, whether it's machine learning, whether it's nowadays Web3 and cryptocurrency and decentralized finance, is getting under that and understanding what is transformative, because often there is a kernel of transformation, and we'll look back in a few years and say, yeah, that was actually transformative. And so that's always important to me as I think about that problem. And then, recognizing that there are a few essential problems that we always face in technology. And with the capabilities we have at a given point in time, we're always trying to solve them. And so what do I mean by that? SOA was trying to solve a problem. It was trying to solve a complexity problem, right? As we have built more and more complex systems, and those can be physical real world systems, or they can be software systems, the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, starts to pull at you. Gravity pulls at you and starts to pull down these structures you've built. As you make these more and more complex, your ability to manage them successfully becomes lower and lower and lower. And so the idea of SOA is the same idea we've always had through history, that the way to tackle complexity is by creating building blocks. building blocks that are atomic, that solve a problem, and that you can now treat as a black box and not have to think about very much. And then you can start to stitch those together with other building blocks, and that helps you manage entropy and complexity, right? And so SOA at the millennium was trying to tackle this problem of, we have this increased complexity, and now we have this other dynamic, which is network connectivity has gone up and the cost of transmission has gone down. So you could actually do this at internet scale, which 2 years prior you couldn't have done, right? Over dial-up, so it doesn't work over dial-up, right? It has to have an always-on high performance for those days connection to work. And now we talk today about microservices, and microservices, is a different way of thinking about the SOA problem of, I've still got to manage complexity. How do I manage complexity? And it's always on a continuum. One of my internal jokes at Workday is the fact that microservices are great. You just don't want too many of them. Like, you don't want your microservices to be too micro, because now you've exchanged one complexity problem, which is this giant stack of monolithic software, for a different complexity problem, which is the orchestration problem of lots of tiny atomic units, right? And now you've just shifted your complexity problem from this one to this one, and you're not actually any better off. Right. And so finding that right balance, given the technologies that you have, is critical.
And then you have the Amazon example, right? Amazon, if you talk to them, they say in the late 90s, when they were trying to build an e-commerce engine, they actually looked at an IBM DB2 solution. It wouldn't scale. So that forced them to think about much more decentralized model, move into services. And my God, in their case, some of the services have become billion-dollar businesses. So
that's right. But that's a great example of looking at the problem and saying the complexity of vertical integration, right? You end up being constrained by whatever the smallest pipe is in your vertical area, and you can't easily segment that out and fix those constraints. Whereas in a decentralized model, I can leave all of these pieces alone and go fix this one piece. And because it's got clean interfaces, and the heart of SOA and the heart of microservices are actually the interfaces between services, not the services themselves, right? And that is really the breakthrough that SOA introduced and now has come to fruition, which is the idea that what matters is interfaces.
So Stein, let's switch gears a little. So you came from the Oracle world. And I always remember it to be OLAP versus OLTP, right? Two different worlds almost. Well, you came to Workday from the Gridcraft acquisition, analytics. Since then, Workday has acquired Adaptive, has adapted Platforma. You've really become a powerhouse in analytics. So tell me, how do you go back to the OLAP and OLTP, difference in cultures? How do you manage the two of them at Workday?
We are less religious about it, to use a word that may not be the most appropriate word, but we're less religious about it than historically there's been between, OLAP and OLTP traditionally in the industry. I think in the early days of the industry, when transaction and relational databases were new technology and there was a number of vendors, the fashion at the time was to run benchmarks and TPS and talk about who had the fastest database. And in some sense, it was a lot about conversations that people have about horsepower, right? Or people have about CPU speeds, right? And over time, we have fewer and fewer conversations, for example, about CPU speeds. There was a point in my career where I could have told you the CPU speed of the processor I had in my laptop or my desktop the minute you asked me, right? But that has become less and less relevant to me every single year. Chances are the workload I have to use on my laptop is not going to be bound by the clock frequency of my CPU. In the same way that the synthetic workloads that we used to talk about for OLTP and OLAP are now irrelevant compared to what is the customer trying to get done. And what the customer is trying to get done is usually a combination of those workloads. At Workday, we talk about plan, execute, analyze as a cycle. You want to plan something, you want to do that thing, and then you want to analyze the results of that thing. And based on that analysis, go back and do planning. And if you want to understand kind of, adaptive purchase, core Workday's transaction engine, and the Platforma Prism analytics engine, there it is, right? That's why we did that. And if we think about the middle step in execute, right? A transaction is just a decision you made. Like you're thinking about doing something and now you're going to do something. That's a right. That's a transaction, right? And so transactions are the embodiment of the decisions you've made. And then analytics are looking at that decision and the consequences of that decision. And does it match what you thought, your original plan, or not? And do you need to adjust? Or has the external world changed in the meantime and you need to adjust? And our goal is to speed up that cycle for our customers, right? Is to make that seamless, to make it coherent, so you're not losing a bunch of time and information in the gaps between these processes, and to make that faster and faster so you can react to change much more quickly than most businesses can today, right? And going forward. And so what that means, so stepping back from the OLTP versus OLAP debate, is it's kind of irrelevant, right? You have to make sure that that whole system works seamlessly. And for us, that means inventing granular subsystems, coming back to the SOA and the microservices, inventing services that are optimized for their piece of that process, whether it's the planning cube, right? A cube technology for planning and looking at different options, looking scenario planning, trying out different things, the transaction engine to make sure that you can do the things you need to do in the time frame you need to do them in, and then the analytics engine that you can slice and dice, query, do all the columnar stuff, right? Not the row inserts of OLTP, but the columnar examination of OLAP to understand the consequences of it.
So Sayan, let's switch course. I know one of your passions has been machine learning.
Mm-hmm.
You've talked a lot about it. You've delivered a lot on it. Help contrast to the machine, when I look at machine learning and AI and so on, the consumer tech world just seems so far ahead of the enterprise tech world. Unfairly so maybe, but you look at, they've been delivering voice recognition, they've been delivering image recognition. The NFL uses next generation stats from Amazon, the decision guide and all that. They just seem to be much more part of our daily lives. The enterprise is still lagging. Is that an unfair statement? Challenge me on my point of view.
No, I think first of all, obviously, your interaction, my interaction with machine learning most of the time is as a consumer, right? Whether it's in obvious ways like voice bots in our home that may be responsive to things. I think all of us recognize that you're probably not really driving your car anymore. You're telling software to drive your car, right? You kind of now your steering wheel is suggesting to the AI, how your car should operate versus, mechanical linkages. And I think that we are understanding that as human beings, that these things are coming in. For the enterprise, it's a little bit of a different analysis, right? It's how do I leverage this to make, positive change? But in many cases, the rest of the value chain has to come along with you to make that work. And I think what's different in consumer is the opportunity to use AI and ML to drive a very specific narrow outcome across a broad set of users. And obviously for, the one of the big differentiators of ML is you've got to have a lot of data. And consumers are great about producing a lot of data, right? And in many enterprise use cases, you don't have massive amounts of data. So you need massive amounts of time in order to derive signal from noise.
Well, you've done a pretty good job with the Skills Cloud, right? But
We have.
is it privacy issues? Why are we not? I mean, think of the enterprise, and you think, gigabytes and gigabytes of data in the big Fortune 500
Yes, that's
companies.
right.
But
So
it
I
seems
would
like
say that
they're not willing to share into the cloud, or there's something that holds them back.
there's a lot of concern, right? And I think that is a part of it, is companies want to be seen as good stewards of their employees' information. And they need to be seen that way. And as an employee of a company, I want to believe that my employer is being very, very careful with my personal information, which is different than me as an individual user saying, yes, hey, I want to share my information with a consumer AI, right? So somebody is acting on my behalf, and how do you think about those things? And obviously that can lead to questions of, are your algorithms biased? Right? It can lead to a number of ethical considerations, bias considerations. What we're also seeing in general is a devolution of data regimes. If we were to spin back a few years, there was a lot of general consensus about data use within a set of countries. And going forward, what we see is much more localized, national-based control of data, which means that as you think about, that in some sense is in direct opposition to what is normal and natural in building AI and ML, which is more data is better, more variety of data is better, and you have to be very thoughtful about how and when you use the data, where that data resides, how it's used. Workday has put in tremendous energy in building the frameworks, the pipelines, and the systems to make sure the data is only where it's supposed to be, only used in a way that our customers have agreed to using it, and making sure that those controls are enforced in software, not just written on paper.
But that makes for smaller data sets to train machines, right?
And it's a bunch of developers who've been working for a very long time on building those frameworks,
Yeah.
right? And that's not the fastest, right? I mean, in some sense, in the enterprise, we are the direct opposite of move fast and break things, right? We want to move fast, but we cannot afford to break things.
So let's talk about, the industry has had just a amazing group of enterprise architects, right? Larry Ellison, Hasso Plattner, Salesforce's Parker Harris, folks like you, just brilliant enterprise architects. I mean, the scaling we've done is just mind-boggling, right? But when it comes to business process, I see a much more conservative approach to, what comes next. Let me give you the example from Amazon, right? Their distribution center, I don't know if you've been to one, but they have miles and miles of conveyor belts. They have hundreds of Kiva robots running around. Everything is automated. The human being does basically the last mile kind of things, right? They completely rethought what a warehouse would be. If an enterprise software company had been approached, they would have said, oh, let's move to the cloud. Let's make the user interface pretty. They really would not have rethought the business process. Is that going to hold us back? How do we make enterprise applications more exciting, much more efficient, productive? You know where I'm going.
Yeah, we have to be willing to break up our existing assumptions, and we have to be willing to let go of some things that we've been holding on to as an enterprise industry. Okay. I think, whether it was Amazon looking at distribution or SpaceX looking at reusability of rockets, sometimes it takes a fresh set of eyes, often coming from other industries, to look at the tried and true beliefs in an industry, right? Essentially the assertion in the rocket industry, to use an example that's near and dear to my own heart, was that you couldn't do reusability, right? Even though they kind of knew that the math only worked in terms of cost to orbit if you could get to reusability, right? But no one was building reusable rockets. And it took a new entrant who had nothing to lose to say, this is what we're going to do. This is where it's going to be. And for us to stay relevant, we have to embrace what you're describing, which is that the tried and true methods of business process don't work anymore. That's not how modern businesses are, right? They have to adapt at timescales that are radically different than what we've traditionally operated on. And I think part of where that comes from, Vinny, is the vendors have said, this is what the market is like. This is ERP, this is MRP, this is HCM, this is CRM, this is, ISM, and we have split the market up and created definitions. But
So I take responsibility for a number of those acronyms. So
and as human beings, we love to categorize things, right? We say, oh, ducks have bills, and beavers have flat tails, and then we get a platypus, and we're like, okay, what do we do with this thing, right? And what category does it go in? And I think that the modern enterprise, those distinctions between components are becoming less and less relevant. They just really don't matter anymore. And we as vendors have been stuck in this viewpoint of, well, this is where my application surface ends and the next one begins. Now, one of the interesting things about Workday, it was founded on the premise that the separation between financials, between ERP and HCM, was an improper separation. If you go under the hood at Workday, we actually don't have separate HCM and financials products. It's one coherent whole because, for a lot of businesses, your human capital is a huge part of your financials. 80, 90% of your spend is tied into your people. And similarly, on the HCM side, the financials are relevant when you think about hiring and staffing and all of these questions that affect it, right? You think about an underpinning technology like Skills Cloud for Workday. It would be one thing if we made Skills Cloud learn against the HCM data, and a different thing if we made it learn against the financials data. But the power in it is when you learn against both, right? What are the outcomes of skills, measurable in financial terms? Right? That's incredibly relevant to the business. And I think what people expect from us is to not buy into these artificial boundaries. And that's where your complaint about how antiquated and how old, I won't be able to even say, some of these approaches are, by artificially saying this is where a process ends and the next one begins.
See, to me, it's also a cultural thing. I think we need to be, as an industry, we need to become a lot more open to process visionaries. The enterprise architects like you have done so well that everybody looks for another Sayan, right? I think we need some of the folks that help Amazon rethink their distribution, or Apple rethink their retail, or even Tesla, right? We need to bring some more of those folks into the industry.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of, honestly, a lot of great ideas coming from the young companies we've acquired, right? Where they have a different viewpoint and they're like, well, have you really thought about this? Like, and our job is not to, not to tell them, well, no, we've already thought about that. It's to tell them, tell me more about that. Talk to me more about what you see and what we should be doing differently. And we as an industry have to be open to that kind of change. I mean, you're even describing bringing in, pure outsiders, outsiders. And I think that's happening anyway. I mean, if you look at the tech community that I started with in the 80s and where we are now, it's a radically different industry.
Look ahead. What excites you over the next few years?
Look, I am incredibly excited by the opportunity in front of Workday to continue to transform ourselves and to tackle really hard problems. And I think what is fascinating for me at this point in time is we are questioning the very fundamentals of what it means to be an employee of a company, what it means to be an enterprise. What is a company? It's no longer a campus of buildings. We've proven that over the last 2 years that whatever it is an enterprise is it's not a campus of buildings, right? And the demands on, and it's a fascinating time to be involved in the enterprise industry when some very basic constructs that we've all used as foundational building blocks of how we think about problems, that there is such a thing as the enterprise, and there is such a thing as an HCM application, and there is such a thing as an employee who has these characteristics, and say, well, maybe that's more true in the exception than it is in the reality, right? This idea of, we used to have this idea of, well, there's full-time employees and there's contingent workers, and people use different terms like that, and that all seems really quaint now, right? It seems really quaint to try to classify things that cleanly and neatly. Again, I think it's a human propensity to try to put things into neat boxes. Sure. Right? But some of the most interesting things happen between the boxes, not in the boxes.
Sayan, that's great. I've told several vendors, quit trying to sell what you had in the bag in January 2020. And yeah, the world has turned upside down. We need to take a fresh look. Sayan, this has been wonderful. We need to do this more often.
Sure.
You need to start talking to the outside world about your architecture and all the wonderful stuff you keep doing.
Yes, we absolutely, and I think that's one of the things that we will be seeing more from Workday is we tend not to talk a lot in general about ourselves. That can be a positive characteristic in certain ways, but in certain other ways, sometimes it's good to remind everyone that, hey, underneath all of this, there's some really interesting things going on, and you should be aware of them. And so, point taken.
Sayan, you have an open invitation every few months, whenever you're ready. Thank you so much.
Sounds great, Vinnie. Always great to catch up.
Thank you.